With us now is Philip Campbell, and he is an author and history teacher, and he is the author of a new book in the Reclaiming Catholic History series from Ave Maria Press, and the book is entitled The Church of the Dark Ages. Philip, thank you for being with us today.
You're very welcome. I'm so happy to talk about this book and this historical period.
It is very fascinating historical period. I know you use the word Dark Ages as an allusion, I think, to what secular history says. But when we think about it from the standpoint of the church and Western civilization, it was a pretty bright time.
It was. This was like the adolescence of the church, when the church was really coming into its own. It had survived the period of the Roman persecutions. It had grown to become the legal and official religion of the Roman Empire. And then after the fall of Rome, it kind of blossomed. And in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire, really helped shape the destiny and the character of what would become medieval Europe. So if you're Catholic, this is a great time to study.
It was interesting, of course, because by the 5th century, many of the well-to-do, if they could, they headed east to Constantinople, which was the Eastern Empire, and they were still living a pretty decent life. But in the West, all of our ancestors, the Goths and the Germans, they were busy thundering through the Italian boot, pillaging and carrying on, your relatives and mine as well. And as a result, there wasn't a whole lot left. And so it was oftentimes the saintly bishops and the saintly popes who took over really the reins of civilization.
Yeah, in urbanized areas like Italy, you mentioned, it's going to be popes and bishops. And then when you get out into the wilderness, like the wild forests of Germany or a place like that, or Ireland, it's going to be monks going out founding monasteries who are going to be the beacons of civilization. So whether you're looking at the urban or the rural, the church is really instrumental in preserving civilization and reforming it in a Christian image during that period.
And the key there is it's preserving. This is where the church oftentimes is. It's an innovator to the extent the Holy Spirit asks us to innovate. But most of the time, again, what we do is we preserve. We preserve the best of what humanity has done. Of course, we preserve the gospel and the teachings of Christ in the church. But within the context of this, how do we do it? And of course, one of the most famous people in the Middle Ages, whose work even today is one of the most well-read books in the world, is The Rule of Saint Benedict.
Yeah, we have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to the Benedictine rule, and I think preservative is a good word. I think of the monks as like incubators that keep education, learning alive through this period. Because I mean, even though it's kind of a great, I wouldn't say golden age, but it's a great time for the church. But in the secular world, things could be pretty bleary during that time. So the fact that so much ancient knowledge survived was due to the Benedictine monks. And I've heard it said that pretty much everything we know about the ancient world, all the ancient manuscripts, whether we're talking about the Iliad or the writings of Julius Caesar, the church fathers, those things only exist today because some monks in the Dark Ages copied them down. So we owe tremendous debt to them for our knowledge of the ancient world.
That's right. And the missionary monks were interesting because most of them came from the East. And many of them came from Egypt, the Desert Fathers. And I know there were some who ended up in Ireland. The monks who came up from there, it's interesting, they trace their history by the towns. And so you have the Egyptian monks coming from there, and then they ended up in Poland, Lublin, and then they ended up in Dublin, and all those towns. They showed kind of a trail of the English Cenobite monks coming up and bringing with it, and as well as developing our understanding of the sacrament of reconciliation that we have today.
Yeah, and that is addressed in the book, too. There's a chapter on how the sacraments developed during this period, because the way the sacraments were in the early church, the sacramental form and matter are going to be the same, but like the manner that they're celebrated in, a lot of Catholics today would be surprised how different they were. Like you mentioned, confession, that it would have been more public in the early church. There would have been grades of penitence. You'd be doing your penance publicly. And like you said, that really gets transformed by the monks, especially the Irish monks, with their penitentiaries and their practice of private confession. So in the book, we talk about that, and also about marriage, how that changes, how the idea of the Eucharist, how that develops, and how it's during the Dark Ages that the church develops the vocabulary to speak about the sacramental presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And so it's just really a developmental time for the church understanding its sacraments.
And it's true. It's also a preservative and a corrective in terms of the promotion of women and their dignity within society, within the family. But especially in this time, of course, there's an explosion of devotion to the Mother of God. And so with that explosion of that brought many converts, especially from the tribes of the north, the Germans and others, as they came down. It was really devotion to Mary that the monks cultivated that really brought them in that life of Christ.
Yeah, help to civilize them and bring a little maternal gentleness to their society.
I mean, some Isaac of Stella and many of the earlier fathers, the 7th and 8th centuries were times of an explosion of these monastic writers, many of whom aren't really known that well today because a lot of their work is still in Latin. But they're being translated slow but sure when we can find them. But I guess the hardest part during this period of the I don't want to call it the early church, but we'll use this for the early Middle Ages is another way, I guess, of putting it, is the relationship between church and state, because the church filled a void, but then you have these tribal leaders like Pepin and then his son Charles the Great and many of the others who have the military weight and the wealth, and the church has to figure out how to get along with this government. And it's going to be an interesting ride.
Yeah, and I think that's really the issue that divides the early Middle Ages from the late Middle Ages. As you know, in the High Middle Ages, like in the 11th century, there's a big blowout between church and empire over the proper boundaries. But like in the latter Middle Ages, there's tons of conflict where the state and the church have this view of like, if you're strong, then I am weak, and they're fighting. But in the earlier Middle Ages, it's more symbiotic. It's more like the church is growing. The barbarian tribes are struggling to establish their kingdoms, and there's this symbiosis where they both kind of think, if you're strong, then I will be strong. And you find church and state reinforcing each other a lot more, and kings taking on pretty dramatic roles, getting involved in church affairs. Like in England at the Synod of Whitby, you have the king of Northumbria deciding which liturgy the church is going to use in England, something that today we would bristle at the idea of a secular ruler deciding that. But it was just a different relationship back then because the church and state were reinforcing each other. But as you mentioned, as time goes on, the Carolingians getting into the High Middle Ages, they're going to start to, especially the time of the Gregorian Reform, they're going to start to bristle against each other, and eventually there's going to be a huge blowout in the 1070s and 1080s.
Well, and part of it, as we say, we get to the end of this period and we have Charlemagne. As you say, these leaders are beginning to make theological decisions. And so you have Alcuin of York wanting to add this statement called the Filioque to the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. And because Charlemagne wants everything uniform throughout his whole empire, they add that in there, which of course then you end this at 1027, another 28 years from there, or actually 27 years from there, we begin to have the break with the East. And one of the issues was that issue of the Filioque.
Yeah, and you're right. Charlemagne wanted uniformity. The Filioque was one result of that. And also something we talk about in the book is how the Roman liturgy spread throughout the West. Like, why was the liturgy of the city of Rome being celebrated in France and in Spain and all these places? And that had to do with the Carolingians as well. They wanted liturgical uniformity, and Charlemagne favored that liturgy of the city of Rome, and even kind of actively discouraged other local Gallican liturgies. And so by the end of the period, we've got pretty much the dominance of the Roman liturgy specifically throughout the West. So much of the development of how, the church, how it looks in the latter Middle Ages, it comes from this period, especially the Carolingian period.
As we're looking towards the eastern part of it, and you don't address it in here, and it's just too much for one person to address. But it was, of course, during this time with the rise of Muhammad and Christianity being cut down to size, and especially in North Africa and half of Spain. And so for the church to hold on to what it did, it took these political powers to really do that.
Yeah, it really did. And if you think about, I mean, with the Islamic wave, at like, I'd say probably 1/3 of Christendom is just kind of lost.
That's right.
It's massive. It must have been traumatic.
We're speaking today with Philip Campbell about his latest book in the Reclaiming Catholic History series, The Church and the Dark Ages. Philip, where can I get a copy of this? Because this has got some great stories in there, and it's really an enjoyable history.
Well, thank you. The best place to get it is just on Amazon. Just look it up on Amazon, or you can get it from Ave Maria Press directly.
Well, we'll link that up on our show notes at sacredheartradio.com. Philip Campbell, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much.